question for you. If you were reading Tanith in the 70s and 80s, were you reading her as a teenager? Was she one of the early sort of science fiction and fantasy authors that you read? And how did
Well,
you come across her?
I was in anthologies. I brought a stack of them with me up here to the office, just sort of as, just for their magic power, their resonance at my elbow. But uh, I was haunting the public library my entire life in Batesburg, South Carolina. I was born in '64. So by the time we're talking mid 70s, around the time Star Wars came out, I was reading everything that had the little rocket ship symbol on it in the spine at the library. And so that's how I was reading Stephen R. Donaldson's original Thomas Covenant trilogy. And I was
Oh, yeah,
reading
yeah.
the later I was reading the later Philip K. Dick novels. And I was reading Le Guin and all these other people that were publishing at the time, and Bradbury, and that got me into reading the anthologies, the year's best, and so forth. And in adulthood, particularly when I realized I was going to be doing this as sort of a career, and it was all tax deductible, I've started systematically acquiring a lot of those books and anthologies that I was reading at the time, with no idea that I would ever be a writer of any kind, much less a writer that deserved to be in such volumes. Um, I can't claim for the anthologies I had any great awareness of one writer versus another. But when we first started talking about this project, I went and started pulling anthologies down from the shelf. And my goodness, there were a lot of Tanith Lee stories in those books that I was reading all along. And and uh, um, and I think when I went back and was rereading so much of this after Clarion West, after I knew that I was not just a journalist, not just a nonfiction writer, but a fiction writer too, and a fiction writer in these vineyards, that um, the stories that were really hitting me, that were really making an impact, Tanith was one of those writers. And what I wish I had done, of course, as we all wish, is that I had just dropped her a note and say, I just reread blah blah. Certainly after Worldcon, I had a little bit of reason to do that. But you don't, you just expect people will always be with you for whatever reason. And we don't praise each other enough, I don't think. I mean, we blurb each other to death, but if we don't often like send a little personal note to say, I really like this thing here that you did, and you should keep doing it. Hope all's well.
All right, Andy
People have
Duncan,
done
I will
that to me.
say I read An Agent of Utopia, and it was really good, and I really appreciate your work, and I hope you continue and are doing well.
well, well, all right. Thank you very much. But uh, Tanith was so much a part of the uh, rewriting, revisioning of the fairy tale of the Gothic. Um, and that was evident in so much of her work and so many of the anthologies in the 80s and 90s, all the Ellen Datlow and Terry Wendling anthologies, not just their overt fairy tale anthologies like Snow White and Blood Red, which those books that Tanith was a staple of. But even in their terrific, never bettered year's best fantasy and horror, those annual volumes, the argument that was being made through all those selections and juxtapositions in the books was so much designed to make us rethink what fantasy was, what horror was. And Tanith was so much a part of that. And yet I didn't really encounter her as a novelist. I didn't even encounter her as an author of story collections. I encountered her as a name in a table of contents in an anthology. So it's very interesting that you're doing this tribute anthology with multiple short stories in it, because that is how so many of us encountered her work to begin with. There were not very many magazines at the time. I was unaware as a teenager of any of them other than the Twilight Zone magazine, because I recognized the brand. And I think Ted Klein was editing it initially, and then later Tappan King was editing it. But I did not know of Asimov's, of Analog, of FNSF. That came later. But until the web zines came along, we were down to about 5 or 6 really magazines in the field. And so you pretty much had to encounter the stories in reprint form in anthologies, and particularly the proliferation of Year's Best, even to see them.